All right, Paul, you ready to get started?
Yes, sir.
All right. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, The Joy of Being a Boring Investor with Paul Moore and Ryan Fisher from Camaplan. Just a quick disclosure here. Camaplan does not give any investment advice or endorse any products. Consult with your accountants, attorneys, and other professionals before making any investments. And this is my contact information, rfisher@camaplan.com. Fisher's with a C there, RFISCHER. You can also reach us at our toll-free number, 866-559-4430. And you can also go to our website and get additional information. So I want to welcome Paul. I'll let you tell us a little bit about yourself before you get started. And in the meantime, I'll stop my share so you can put yours up. All right. Welcome, Paul.
Hey, welcome. I mean, thank you. Welcome to you. Okay, great. I'll be here all week. I'm going to work on getting this screen share going, and hopefully I will do better than I have so far. How are you?
Quite all right. Thanks for being with us. Yep.
Good. Can you see my screen?
I can. You're up and running.
Ryan, I can't figure out why would anybody sign up for this webinar. I mean, the joy of being a boring investor. I think if I was getting this email, I don't know if I would have signed up for it, but I hope by the time we're done, you all will take something away from this. This has been the most meaningful concept to me in my years of investing in real estate. I'm in my third decade of investing in real estate. I've written a couple books, this book called The Perfect Investment, humble title, huh? And also more recently, Storing Up Profits, which is a Bigger Pockets published book on self-storage investing. So today we're going to talk about the joy of being a boring investor. And I hope that none of you end up like this guy, but I know it is possible. And so I'll be, Ryan, just keep a lookout for me, and maybe Ryan just flag me down if people are falling asleep. Before we talk about boring investors, though, I want to talk about what I was for years. And there's actually a guy who's got this program, How to Be an Entrepreneurial Investor. Well, for me, being an entrepreneurial investor was a disaster because I was an entrepreneur at heart. I loved the thrill of the chase. I loved starting things, staying in startup mode. I love getting a rush out of the process of starting a new business. Repeating the learning curve actually seemed fun to me. And you know what I did? I got a broad, but not a deep knowledge about a whole bunch of different things. And you know what I did? As far as an entrepreneur, I struck out a whole bunch of times. I hit a few grand slams, maybe 3. But I actually struck out. And actually, I know I probably don't look like I'm in my 50s. You're making me blush, guys. Come on. But seriously, I'm in my late 50s. And and Luke's over there on my side going, he looks like he's in his 80s. Anyway, seriously, I speculated a lot. I thought I was a full-time investor, but I was really more of a full-time speculator. And I did the same thing in investing as I did as an entrepreneur. And, a lot of these folks who do this, these real estate developers, they can end up being the wealthiest people or they may end up failing. And there's nothing wrong with working at Walmart, by the way. But I mean, it's probably not why most of you are on a Camaplan webinar. You're probably here because you want to do something different. And I'm going to propose today that being a boring investor is a more certain path to true wealth and multi-generational stability of your assets and holdings. And so we're going to talk about that today. I'm going to fly through a whole lot of slides. And if you want to learn more about any of this stuff, feel free to reach out to Ryan there or reach out to us, and we can talk more about this. But I'm going to start by saying that boring investors attain true wealth. Now, you may think, and I may think, that true wealth is having a mansion or driving, a Lamborghini or whatever. But true wealth, I would define now as somebody who's been investing for like 30 years as having assets that produce cash flow. Warren Buffett said, if you don't know how to make money while you sleep, you'll have to work until you die. And so for those of you familiar with the Robert Kiyosaki cash flow quadrant, I'm talking about the lower right quadrant, basically having assets that produce more assets, having cash that produces more cash, and not have to work, basically work until you die. And I think that's why many of you invest with through Cama plans. Boring investors enjoy true freedom. There's a lot of ways to be in bondage, even if you're a billionaire. And we all have heard stories of people who have made it. They've made all the money they ever wanted to, but they keep grinding, and sometimes they lose it. I know of people I know of a guy who made $100 million, lost it all, and then made it again. He put himself under a lot of pressure he probably didn't need to. But I would postulate, and by the end of this talk, I'm going to talk to you about why I think we're on the earth for more than just grinding. True investors, boring investors, enjoy freedom from trading hours for dollars, freedom about worrying about the price of your options, your crypto account, or the next GameStop. There's nothing wrong with that stuff at all. But I'm saying worrying about it, toiling over it. Freedom from toilets, tenants, and trash. Freedom to use your time and money to make a difference in the world. Freedom from agonizing over every financial decision. Boring investors enjoy true freedom, and they avoid hidden costs. I've got a friend, he's an investor with Wellings Capital. His name's Kevin. And Kevin told me that he had stock options at the same company he worked at. He was making over $1 million a year when I met him, when he worked for Amazon. But this other company, he had all these stock options, and he agonized over them day and night. He said he lost sleep. He got up in the middle of the night. He would analyze the price again. He said basically he had a lot of hidden costs. And I thought, hidden costs? What do you mean? He said his health suffered, his freedom suffered, his relationships suffered. And he said he lost something that was even more important than time. He lost focus. Now, in today's world, where it's said that the average person touches their smartphone 2,600 times a day, wow. We live in a time where focus is a huge commodity that's being lost. And, I'm guessing if you're like me, you're having a hard time focusing on relationships, friendships, on anything. And I notice, these people who are chained to stock tickers and chained to social media and things like that, those things are exciting, but they cause you to lose focus. Kevin lost money. He said at best he broke even with all his worry about his stock options, but he lost health. He lost progress in his job. He lost he lost relationships. Kevin was not truly free during that time. And now he really is, because this is why he's taught me a lot of this stuff. Boring investors avoid these hidden costs. Boring investors lose money and make a fortune. I'm actually referring to my podcast here. I've got a podcast I had for 4 years called How to Lose Money. And you can listen to that on iTunes or Stitcher, other places. I learned from this podcast. I interviewed all these famous people and learned that most of them made a fortune from the pain they suffered because they turned stressors into strengths. This is what boring investors do. My pastor used to say, trials can make you bitter or trials can make you better. And most of the great investors I have taught to have become better, and they turn their stressors and their losses and their pain into strengths. Boring investors don't drive a Lamborghini. Now, of course, they could, but my point in saying this is that a lot of the folks you see on late night infomercials, one guy in particular who's a multifamily investor who has pictures everywhere with him and his 2 jets. I saw one of that guy's deals, and he was actually buying a multifamily property for a 1.5% cap rate. That's like a third of that is like 3 times higher, I should say, than a good price. Okay, so he's paying a lot. What he's doing when he does that is he's causing his investors to have to count on inflation to bail them out. They have to hope everything goes well, and hope is not a good business strategy. Boring investors don't drive a Lamborghini. A lot of them are people that you know that actually you would never even imagine were great investors, but they are. Boring investors don't get the buzz of grinding harder. I used to love weekends because I had more time to work uninterrupted from phone calls, emails, and all kinds of interruptions. And I would rather work on a Saturday or Sunday, and I got a buzz from it. I got excited. I felt that buzz. But boring investors don't get a buzz out of their investments. In fact, boring investors would probably more likely follow the words of the famous investor, George Soros, who said, investing should be boring. If you're having fun, you're probably not really investing. Boring investors don't get a buzz out of grinding harder through their investments. Boring investors say no a lot. Warren Buffett said the best investors say no a whole lot. The very best investors say no almost all the time. Now, when I was an entrepreneurial investor, I said yes to everything I could. But now my default is to say no. And that makes me a lot more boring. It actually hurts some relationships because I've got a bunch of friends I would love to invest with, but they don't meet the criteria in many cases that we have as a company for investments. And so we have to be a little more boring. And speaking of Buffett, I mean, Buffett lives the most boring life imaginable. For about 60, probably more like 70 years, he sits in a little room staring at pieces of paper literally 6 to 8 hours a day. He doesn't have any appointments to speak of. He doesn't take calls. He only got a smartphone recently under pressure from his largest holding, Apple. And so Buffett's life is really, really boring, but he's been a great investor. And as you probably know, or you may have heard, he has a 30 million% ROI in 60 years, which, let's put it this way, Buffett could lose 99.4% of Berkshire Hathaway's value and still beat the S&P 500. Now, you may not believe that, but the math is very simple to calculate. It's really true. 99.4%, he'd still beat the S&P 500 for the, I think it's 57 years he's been at the helm of Berkshire Hathaway. Boring investors say no a lot, and boring investors don't swing, you bum. What I'm referring to is Buffett. Buffett says that unlike baseball, you can't get a called strike in investing. You can leave the bat on your shoulder, and where you would either walk in baseball or strike out more likely by not swinging, you can't get that. Won't happen to you in investing. And even though the whole stands are all yelling at you, swing, you bum. And they've been doing that to Buffett for years. There's so many stories about Buffett being mocked, even by his own shareholders. Like when he had $130 billion in cash in the bank for many of the last several years. He's had 130 billion, did I say million? 130 billion in the bank sitting in reserves because he's not willing to swing, because he says, look, I don't ever get a strikeout from not swinging. He's waiting for blood to run in the streets, and he hasn't been seeing it for a long time. Boring investors don't swing as much as exciting, glamorous investors do. Boring investors sometimes look like lucky amateurs. Now, a famous quote that I like is Warren Buffett said that the rising tide, sure, the rising tide has lifted all boats for a long time. And as a real estate investor, I would say the rising tide has lifted all boats for the last 14 years since the Great Recession. But someday, Buffett says, someday that tide's going to go out, and then we'll see who's skinny dipping. Boring investors' returns over the last 14 years or so look like lucky amateurs. And what I mean is true professionals and lucky amateurs have both been crushing it the last 12 or 14 years. It's hard to tell them apart. And I promise you, I'm not knocking this. I met with a guy last night who is in high school and he wants to be an investor. There's nothing wrong with being a high school investor. Luke, who's on the call with me right now, he made a lot of money investing over the last couple of years, and he's in college. But if you're giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to a lucky amateur who just started in real estate, let's just say in 2016, I don't know, they may not, if they haven't experienced a downturn or, a real down cycle like the great financial crisis, it may not be the best choice on your part. And I would say boring investors often have the same performance over the last decade as lucky amateurs. In fact, next slide, they actually have lower returns, sort of. Here's what I mean. Because the rising tide has blurred the lines between expert and amateur, it also has meant that, get this now, the lucky amateurs, or skilled amateurs, you could say, have actually done better. In other words, the boring investors, the true professionals, have actually had lower returns. Now, how could that possibly be? Well, in some cases, the boring investors, the professionals, are actually taking insurance policies out. In other words, they're like Buffett, they're leaving some of their money in cash. Or a real simple example is they might buy the same deal that the amateur might put 80% debt on, so they could leverage, 5-to-1 ratio to leverage their returns. Well, that, the professional might say that deal's too risky. I'm going to put 50% leverage on that same deal. We know folks who are leveraging their deals at 50%. If they would have gone 80, their returns to the investors would have been so much higher. But they're taking insurance policies because they've been through downturns. They might have lost it all in the Great Recession. I might have interviewed them on my podcast. And honestly, they seem to have lower returns. This is something that's really important, especially for where we are now in the financial cycle. You won't really know who the best investors are until the tide goes out, until your investment strategy collides with a downturn. That's when you'll know if you're investing or speculating. And that's when you'll know if the person and the people you're investing with are really professional investors, or sometimes, skinny dippers. I don't want to invest with skinny dippers. I don't want to invest with speculators. And again, I've got some money in crypto. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying, as far as my investments, I'm trying to basically look for the long time horizon holds like Buffett does. He said his favorite holding time is forever. Now, I'm not really that extreme, but Buffett has this long-term mentality and this mentality of investing in assets that produce cash flow, which my first slide said that is true wealth. Speculators, basically investing versus speculating. Investing is when your principal is generally safe and you've got a chance to make a return. Speculating is when your principal is not at all safe and you've got a chance to make a return. But investing can sometimes look boring. In fact, Paul Samuelson, the first Nobel Peace Prize winner from the US in economics, said investing should be boring. It should look more like watching paint dry or watching grass grow. He said, if you want excitement, take $800 and go to Las Vegas. That's what exciting investors sometimes do with their investments as well. Boring investors have lower returns, sort of, and they stay in their circle of competence. Charlie Munger is Warren Buffett's partner. He's an old curmudgeon, but he's got a friend named John Arriaga. And John Arriaga decided decades ago he was going to be a boring investor. He said, I'm only going to invest in real estate within 1 mile of Stanford's campus. That doesn't sound like a really good plan to me. I mean, as somebody who looked over the Carolinas, Kentucky, Georgia, and Texas for multifamily assets at one time, 1 mile of the perimeter of Stanford's campus? Yeah, that's what John Arriaga did. And he became a billionaire doing this. Now, what was his circle of competence? Well, it wasn't real estate investing. It wasn't real estate investing in America. It wasn't real estate investing in California or Northern California. It was real estate investing within 1 mile perimeter of Stanford's campus. And that's how he became a billionaire, staying inside a very small but very clearly defined circle of competence. If you're a doctor or a dentist or an attorney, or you're enjoying your retirement, I would propose to you that maybe your circle of competence might not be commercial real estate. It might be finding and vetting the very best operators or syndicators or fund managers in commercial real estate and giving them the money to invest. On the other hand, if your circle of competence includes flipping houses, or if it includes a certain type of real estate, go for it. I'm all for it. And as you know, you can do a lot of that through your CAMA IRA. So boring investors stay inside their circle of competence, but they also sometimes investing in boring assets. The first time I heard about value add self-storage, I think I laughed my head off. I mean, what are we talking about? Where's the cabinets and new countertops and beautiful fake hardwood flooring and the bark park, all the stuff you get in apartments? Self-storage is 4 pieces of sheet metal, some rivets, a floor, and a door. It's pretty boring. But self-storage has roared out of the great financial crisis as the top, according to Wall Street Journal and New York Times, the top producing commercial real estate asset. The returns for investors in this boring asset class have been pretty phenomenal for the last many years. And another boring asset class that people looked down their nose at was mobile home parks. Yet Sam Zell, arguably the most successful real estate investor in America, maybe the world, has been collecting up, I think it's 155,000 mobile home park lots over several decades, while other people completely ignored them or just looked down their nose. And I would say to them and to myself, live where you want, but invest where it makes sense. And some people found that it makes sense to invest in boring assets like self-storage and mobile home parks. Boring investors invest in the gold rush. Well, sort of. You might remember the 1849 gold rush in California or the 1880s and 90s gold rush in the Yukon and Alaska. A lot of those people never made it there. And you can imagine this. In fact, I think I read 30% of the people who tried to cross the pass to the Yukon to get gold in the Alaskan gold rush, only 30% of people ever made it through the pass. A lot of them turned back. A lot of them died. A lot of them suffered and bled along the way. And, you know, I think it's kind of ironic. You guys know where I'm going with this. The people who made money in the gold rushes were often the people who sold picks and shovels. Sometimes they were the people who provided lodging or transportation. They weren't the ones looking for gold. Some of the gold people made money, but I heard it was a very, very tiny fraction of the people who tried. It was exciting to try. It seemed like really fun, like to say, wow, my ancestor was panning for gold rather than my ancestor was selling picks and shovels. But those people who sold picks and shovels, far as I know, they could afford, in some cases, like in California, to vacation in those same mountains where these gold, the gold rush people often bled and often died and often went broke. And so I would argue that boring investors invest in the gold rush, but they do it differently than those chasing gold in some cases. Boring investors also have a long view. I already mentioned that Buffett, he has a quote that says his preferred hold time is forever. This is the opposite of day trading. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But I've noticed that boring investors have a longer view. They have longer hold times. They have less friction, less transaction costs. A lot of folks who are having to refinance their 2 or 3 or 4 year notes right now are suffering because interest rates have gone up. And by the way, I talked to an insider who says they're going to go up another 0.5 point in June and 0.5 point in July. We'll see if that happens. But I'm getting a lot of questions about this. I'm getting a lot of questions about how interest rates and how, all this stuff's going to affect our investments. Well, if you have a very long view, did you know the average increase in interest rates from the Fed is only 2 to 2.5 years? I don't think that's the average. I think that's the longest is like 2.5 years. And so if you have a 5, 10, 20 year mindset, well, you're going to ride through those ups and then ride them back down. And by the way, inflation that took place during those years while you rode through that up and down cycle will likely keep your rents and therefore your revenues and ultimately your profits at a higher level if you have a long view, which can be boring. Boring investors also diversify. Warren Buffett said something like, and I haven't got the quote, but he said something like diversification is for idiots. I didn't think that was very nice. I like diversifying. And then I looked at Buffett's portfolio. He's got roughly 100 companies in there. I mean, he's got Heinz Ketchup and Dairy Queen and Geico and See's Candy and Clayton Homes and 21st Mortgage and Berkadia. He's got tremendous diversification. And by the way, he's got 28 people in his headquarters managing all this. What that tells me is they're not experts at picking, Heinz Ketchup flavors or bottling or, Clayton Homes home designs. They're not experts. They're experts at picking experts. You see what I mean? They're experts at diversification. Now imagine Michael Phelps decided he wanted to win 27 gold medals, let's just say, up front. He might have thought, well, I can't do that just in the pool. He might have thought, I want to go out and learn to throw the javelin and shot put and long jump and run and do all these different things, but he didn't. He stayed in his lane and he focused on one thing. And of course, he won 27 gold medals. And the United States, which what I would say that would be analogous to us as investors with an expert, all got the benefit of having those gold medals for our country. So boring investors diversify. They don't chase shiny objects. I think I've already touched on this. I used to chase a lot of shiny objects and I made some money doing it, but I lost more money and I lost a lot more time and a lot more stress. Boring investors don't do that. And they choose a lane and stay in it. Here's a 3-step strategy. This is really powerful to becoming the wealthiest person in the world. This is just 3 steps, simple steps. Number 1, choose a lane and stay in it. Okay. Choose a lane at a young age. Bill Gates chose a lane. He said, I want to be in computers when he was like 12. And that was only in like 1968. Okay. I want to stay in computers. Number 2, he found the biggest, most influential company in the world that would agree to partner with him. And of course, that was IBM. Number 3, here's a surprise. Gates did everything in his power to make them successful, not to make himself successful. As a result, he became the wealthiest guy in the world. Go and do likewise. Okay. Boring investors don't get the buzz of grinding harder. I already talked about grinding harder. I already talked about how if I worked harder, I would feel more satisfied. If I was exhausted after 4 hours sleep, I actually felt good about myself. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's a good way to live. And it causes a lot of health problems. And you know what they say? If you haven't got your health, you know the rest. Boring investors suffer mockery and misunderstanding. Buffett, it was 1999. He was in his annual gathering of billionaires in Sun Valley, Idaho, and people were whispering, he's lost it. He's lost it. He's like 79. He's actually, what was he, 79? No, he was 70 years old at the time, 69 even. And they were saying he lost it. He had dementia. What was wrong with him? He had missed the whole tech bubble. People were making thousands of percentage return on their investments. And Buffett got up in that whole group and he confidently stated, he said, I would rather invest in Wrigley's gum than the internet. I don't know where the internet will be in 10 years. I know how people will be chewing gum in 10 years. And people chuckled. Well, just months later, of course, the tech bubble burst. And a lot of the people who mocked him lost everything. Boring investors are willing to suffer that mockery and misunderstanding along the way. Boring investors focus on protecting the downside. Buffett's most famous quote is the first rule of investing, right? Don't lose money. Second rule, see rule number 1. They focus on protecting the downside before they look for profits. Boring investors sometimes live next door. Now, you may not recognize them. They may not live in a mansion or drive a flashy car, and they might even invest in the unseen realm. If you guys know about the company Exchange Right, I talked to the co-founder recently, and he told me that he and his partner, they live on what they need for their family, and they save some for their family in case something goes wrong, and then they give the rest away. He said they'd given away $41 million in a fairly short time. These were young guys, way younger than me. You might say that's not hard, but boring investing often means not chasing the shiny object, not doing all the things to make your own nest egg better, to make your own life better. And boring investing can sometimes look like the guy or the gal next door. In fact, boring investors invest in something else that seems boring, and that is relationships. You know, who was it? I'm just forgetting his name. Said no one ever wished on their deathbed that they had worked more hours. And he said, he basically was talking about investing in relationships. And I would say that investing in relationships, your kids, your husband or wife, your friendships, that doesn't give you the same buzz that many of you, including me, sometimes get from working, but it's actually a better, that might sound boring, but is a better way to live. I really admire Elon Musk in so many ways, but even though he's 50% wealthier than Jeff Bezos, as the wealthiest guy in the world, last I checked, I don't know how rich he really is, because he's got multiple kids from multiple women who don't even speak to him. And that makes me really sad. But as far as I can tell, he hasn't invested in relationships the way he's invested in his business. Boring investors are go-givers. If you've read the book, the Go-Giver book talks about the law of value, the law of compensation, the law of influence and authenticity and receptivity. These principles, the Go-Giver principles, they sound kind of boring. And if you read the book, you'll see how the main character just was painfully giving up all these opportunities, and he eventually won out in the end. Boring investors invest in silence and solitude and Sabbath. I already mentioned to you that I used to love weekends because I could work more undistractedly, but now I value things like silence. I like to take time in the morning to actually meditate. I like a Sabbath. I really like enjoying rest. And the more boring I become, I guess, the more I do these things. And I actually think my health has benefited, and I think my work's benefited as well. Boring investors invest in happiness. Now, this is crazy, and this actually changed. It's something deep inside of me shifted when I heard about this study. There's a study that says that you will not be any happier if you make over $95,000 a year than you would at 95. And here's what I mean. You'll be happier, the study says, at 60,000 than 50, and you'll be happier at 95 than you would at 80. But if you get any higher than that, and let's say with inflation, that's a little over 100,000, you won't be any happier. So if you're at 110,000 or 1,010,000 or $1 billion a year, you won't be any happier than you would be at about 100,000. Now, if that's true, think about it. Why are we grinding so hard? There may be a good reason to do it, like if you want to give a lot. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But boring investors invest in true happiness. And sometimes that includes relationships. And sometimes that also includes investing in the unseen realm where there's no apparent return on investment. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he should be, I'm going to argue, perhaps the most influential, important person of the last 1,000 years. And you might not have heard of him, even though he lived right across the pond in England. William Wilberforce changed the world forever. William Wilberforce was super wealthy. He got elected to I think it was the House of Lords or the House of Commons at 21 years and 2 weeks old. As soon as he could get elected, he got elected. He came from very wealthy family. He lived in a beautiful mansion. He had all this unimaginable wealth. And at one point, he was completely turned around when he heard about slavery. I mean, he knew about slavery, but when he saw the horrors of the slave trade, he completely changed his life. And he actually gave the rest of his life. He was born in 1759, and this transition happened in the early 1790s, like maybe 94. And he gave the rest of his life till the 1830s. He gave his health, his time, and his wealth to trying to shut down the slave trade and then abolish slavery as a whole. And he had incredible hardships, mockery, misunderstanding, and no end to ridicule. His place in social circles was gone. Everything. He gave up everything to invest in this unseen realm where there was apparently no return on investment. He actually died not very wealthy. In fact, he his home and everything else he had, it didn't appear that he made, if you just looked at the outside, you might have thought, hey, wasn't that successful? I would say he's the most successful person perhaps in 1,000 years. And he had massive impact on society. There's a movie called Amazing Grace that just touches on the impact he had on society, in addition to ending the slave trade. William Wilberforce invested in the unseen realm, and he invested for a testimony, not a title. There's a lot of people who invest for a testimony and not a title. And when they do, sometimes they go through a lot of pain. A lot of times they seem boring. Mother Teresa's life seems incredibly boring if you really looked at what she did every day, but she had a testimony more than she had a title. Boring investors do that, and boring investors invest to leave a legacy. There are billions of people on the planet. The whole Western Hemisphere for sure has William Wilberforce to thank, not only for ending slavery, but for a whole bunch of other things he accomplished in his lifetime that had a massive impact on society. For example, when Wilberforce was young, they used to hang people in the streets, and people would stand around and mock them while they were hanging them. And they would actually punch them and do all kinds of things. There was incredible, horrible civil things that Wilberforce determined and he was able to end. He had incredible influence. He had incredible legacy. And the guy is just, like I said, he's my hero. I think it's really important that we as boring investors have a big why. And if you haven't got your own big why, let me tell you mine. Maybe you can borrow it. If you took the record profits, not the average, but the record profits, Ryan, in Apple, General Motors, Nike, and Starbucks, record profits, added those together, doubled that, you would get the approximate profits generated by human trafficking every year, according to the US State Department. And so a lot of folks who have found this out, they don't know what to do. What do I do? Do I go join a raid in a brothel in Thailand? Or do I quit my job and go to work for this task force? Or do I give money to some organization that I don't really know where it goes? Well, a lot of us struggle with those questions. And so my company, Wellings Capital, we are taking up this cause, and our goal is to try to free 5,000 slaves and make them survivors and give them a new life in the next 5 years. So boring investors invest to leave a legacy. Ryan, that's all I got.
All right, great. If anybody has any questions, they can type them in to the chat box. Appreciate the information, Paul. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or you're all set?
I don't think so. I think I covered it all. I just can't tell you how impactful this has been. I'm thinking about my friend Kevin. Kevin sails through I don't know how you say it right, the Puget Sound, like near Washington. He sails and relaxes now instead of checking his stock ticker. And he actually has taken money out of all these these ups and downs things. And he's just putting it into real estate and investing passively. His life is so much better. When you call Kevin, he's chill. He used to be so tense. And by his own words to me. And so I just really recommend that people consider this. And, before it's too late and, you've lost family, relationships, health, etc. This is, and I'm working on this stuff myself. I fail as much as I succeed, but I'm working on it.
Thanks, Paul. What was that? I appreciate the ideas. Okay. how can people get a hold of you? Just go to your website at wellingscapital.com.
Yeah. We've got a lot of information there about the different asset classes we invest in, like self-storage and mobile home parks and more. And you can get that information at wellingscapital.com. You can specifically go to wellingscapital.com/resources for more.
All right. Well, appreciate the info. Thanks for taking time out of your day to be with us, Paul. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to Paul or myself. Thanks for being on. Thanks, Paul.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everybody.